Well, welcome back to another episode of the Green Dragon podcast. Today, we're delighted to have Dr. Virginia Arbery join us. Um, she is a professor at Wyoming Catholic College. Both Isaac and I studied under her here, and it's been an honor and privilege to become her friend. And then I'm glad that she can come and talk to us about her thoughts on decorum.
It's good to have you.
Thank
So
you.
good to see you again. It's
Like,
been
we're
a long time.
two gentlemen who embody decorum and deference and all those things that are so fragile in our world. It seems that the equalizing effect of democracy is taking its toll on manners in the United States.
It really
I know you
has.
gentlemen will remember reading Tocqueville
Mhm.
and his concern, though he likes the Americans very much, and he's not mourning over the loss of the aristocratic, but he's pretty clear about the fact that the Americans scorn forms
Mm.
because they're a residual um, indication of class and superiority of wealth or education or breeding. So the Americans, even those who are greatly unequal in their education or their wealth or their circumstances, try to seem like the ordinary man. And so the indication always is not of my status, but I'm one of you. Right?
Mm.
But we could talk about that more. There are certain benefits to that, but there's certain losses to that.
Mm.
Yeah. So after reading some of your speech, because I wasn't able to get through all of it, unfortunately, but
Right.
I definitely wanted to hear what you define decorum to be.
Yes, decorum. It's an old world word. I think, it's one of those words that are like your grandmother's old rusty tarnished silver in the china closet that nobody opens anymore. It's an old word because it uh, indicates a former way of life.
Mm.
The decorum is more than style. It's not just having a certain panache um, or flair that's your style, but it's the graciousness that accompanies style. I like to think of decorum as a keen awareness of the time, place, and persons with whom you find yourself. So decorum allows you to be pleasing to others in that circumstance. It softens whatever your presuppositions
Mhm.
might be about the other.
Mm.
You might know things about um, an old uncle who comes to
Mhm.
visit that you've heard from your parents, and this information might dampen your respect. But because he is the old uncle, you still defer to him, stand up when he comes in the room, show him all the signs of courtesy that you would if you didn't know about these things. So it's
Mm.
decorum is a way of screening those things that might divide us. So often when we find ourselves, for instance, on the streets of Lander on a day in which we're supporting life, marching down the street and then all gathering at the town square, you might just want to ignore the shopkeeper who's on the other side who doesn't agree with you,
Mm.
because that's a day in which you're really standing on a very important position. And yet, if we don't have that graciousness toward the person that we buy jewelry from, or pottery, or clothing in town, our neighbors, how will we win them over to our ideas? So
Mm.
decorum is not only that which screens opinions about one another and raises up those encounters, but it also provides a point of entry for understanding. which otherwise wouldn't be there if we were just combative or indifferent to one another.
Mm. Yeah, being combative is a really good way of turning people off to conversation with you, for
Mhm,
sure.
mhm,
Um, but with like the shopkeeper across the street, if you're sitting there with your pro-life signs,
mhm,
um, and like what would be an example of showing decorum to that individual who doesn't necessarily agree with you if they came up and
mhm,
tried to have a conversation that would be
mhm.
conflicting with your ideas?
Well, you would have the same courtesy to that person in inquiring about their well-being as you would to the ones with whom you agree.
Mhm.
You would, if you know them, ask about how's their work going, or you may know their families, you know. I found myself in this situation where we were in a pro-life march and we were told to stay away from the other side.
Mm.
Mm.
And I didn't. I walked over and started talking. And before we knew it, 10, 15 other people from one side came over to the other side, and there were real conversations going on. They weren't always turnaround moments,
Mhm.
but they established the common thing that holds us together, even when so many people suffer under illusions and false views of rights. Um, and that is that we still have to be civilized to one another.
Mhm.
So I guess one of the things in answering your question, Isaac, about what is decorum, part of the root word of decorum comes from the word to teach in Latin. You're teaching in decorum all the time. When you're rearing your children, for instance, and you'll be, God willing, having some after your marriage to Julia. How wonderful to learn that today.
Yes.
Um, One of the things you do, first of all, is say, don't do this or do that. And if you're from the South, you say, that's ugly. Now, don't, and
Mm.
I won't give an example because
Mhm.
they're probably too earthy, but that's ugly. Don't do it. You know, and that's a very good way of getting at the notion of decorum, because
Oh.
decorum is related not only to teaching, but to teaching about the beautiful, right? What
Oh.
makes life beautiful?
Mhm.
And that requires that a child learn, because just feeding his or her own appetites without regard to others around, or uh, being a certain way, as St. Augustine says, children can be awful, yell and scream and insist on their own priority with their parents. If the parents don't put any boundaries there, that child is going to get used to pushing himself or herself forward instead of deferring to others. So they learn very young, right, what the proper behavior is, what's ugly and what's beautiful. I guess another distinction I should make about this word decorum, gentlemen, is that it is um, different than charity.
Mm.
It's different than virtue. You can have beautiful, uh, lovely soul, soul directed toward God, and have horrible manners.
Mm.
You know,
Yeah.
they don't always go together. And, uh, you know, there are certain customary behaviors at the table or with old people or ladies, you know, that come out of the long struggle of civilization, right?
Right.
Which was hard to arrive at. It's just not anything automatic. So charity isn't the same thing, or virtue. They're uh, very dubious people morally who have decorum.
They
Mm.
do. Yeah.
So we have to be careful about why this word decorum and what it means is meaningful given that fact. And I'd be happy to talk about that more if you want to pursue it.
Well, something you're talking a lot about in your speech was that decorum is like putting the pause before something,
Mhm,
like
mhm,
not being hasty,
mhm,
and then also like the example of the the
Mhm.
distance between the cup and the lip.
Yeah,
I remember that
Mm.
in humanities class.
good.
Um,
I think that's one thing everybody remembers. I don't know if they remember all the
It's a
Federalist
good image.
papers,
yeah.
but yes, delay.
Like, yeah.
So delay is that seemingly meaningless action in our rituals that actually raises up very important moments in life and even ordinary moments from being just getting it done or efficient to doing it beautifully or aesthetically. I think I used in class the distinction made by the Southern critic poet John Crow Ransom, who writes an essay called Forms and Citizens. And in that essay, he says, we're used to wanting something built or done or accomplished, which requires efficiency in a sense of the economics of a situation.
Mm-hmm.
So those, of course, are what he calls efficient forms or economic forms. But those are different than what he calls aesthetic forms, which require what you've suggested, Tom, a delay in order for them to become something beautiful or aesthetic. And he gives two major examples. One is courtship, and the other is burials. So the beginning of life and the ending of life. And in the example of the woman and the man, he offers this triangle. So the bottom of the triangle would indicate the boy gets the girl quickly because he desires her, and the most efficient way to get her would be just to take her,
Mm-hmm.
not to put too fine a point on it, without any preliminary courtship. She would then be just the object of desire, man, female. The other way that gives that desire, and the desire is still there, but it's handled differently, is the aesthetic way, where the man sees the beautiful woman, the virtuous woman, what have you, and goes through a slow process of knowing her, properly meeting her parents, being in situations in which they gather together in conversation. And after a process of courtship, marrying her, and that process turns the female, the woman, into a lady, and the male, man, into a gentleman.
Hmm.
Burial the same way. If you remember your Solon and Lycurgus, or so many of the things we've read in the ancient world together, the burial rites usually required a limit on wailing, because
Oh,
the
yeah.
women would wail
Mm.
forever
That's right.
and never restrain their grief. So the burial ceremony takes the corpse, which could be the object of infinite grief, and
Mm.
turns it into a ritual which raises the grief into a ceremony, which then allows all the mourners to return to life, which
Hmm.
is what they should do. And so that becomes an aesthetic form, which, as it were, purges the grief so that it can be rechanneled into joy and living again.
Mhm.
Many other examples that we can think of. The political one that you raise is analogous, I would argue, in teaching separation of powers, that the critics who say it slows us down, it takes too long to pass through the two houses of Congress, and then to go to the president, and then go back to the Congress if it's defeated, and it just goes on and on and on. And this gridlock is horrible. And I would say, no, it in fact makes possible what Harvey Mansfield calls the constitutional space,
Mm.
which is described by his fellow political theorist Martin Diamond as the separation between the cup and the lip. You delay the taking of the cup to your mouth in the same way that you delay wolfing down your food And it's in that space between the cup and the lip that conversation, deliberation, and thought and a better decision derives. Yeah, so that's what that old analogy is, Tom.
Oh.
Delay almost in everything. If you remember the story of Gideon and who gets chosen to be in the army, they're the ones who delay drinking the water. They don't drink it like the dogs do, lapping it with their tongues, but they take their hands and bring the water to their mouths. Teaching those little things in life has to happen early, and it's very hard to teach them to an adult if they haven't already learned them.
It seems like decorum involves a certain level of modesty, but also kind of a chivalry that is extended to all. Does that sound
Yeah.
like accurate or make sense? This is kind of what I was thinking about when you were talking. Like you have to be
Yeah.
modest in your appearance, but also your speech.
Yes.
And then chivalrous, where you might not like the other person, but you're still going to give them the respect that they deserve as a human.
Yeah. Of course, you're tapping into the medieval roots of this. Louise Cowan, the teacher of my husband and myself, who's so influential in our literary curriculum here, roots chivalry in the Achaeans going to Troy to get back Helen. If you look at the medieval tradition, it's really predicated on that older notion of protect the lady, protect the virtue of the lady, even the lady that's not a lady all the time. Right?
Oh, Helen.
Yeah, because you raise her up by treating her as one. Now it may be pie in the sky like Don Quixote and Dulcinea, who is not a lady, but she's a prostitute, but he's sure she's a lady. You might be pie in the sky, but it's that disposition to elevate, you see. And if you and the same way with the lady who is expecting something from the man and being a gentleman, right? And these old norms, I'm going to say, I think it's evident not only in Homer, but in Herodotus. I just taught Herodotus to the freshmen, and reading that again, it was clear to me that it begins with the abduction of women, not only Helen, but others, Io and Medea and so on. And it ends with the violation of women, the mutilation of women by Xerxes' horrible wife, who's jealous of his different lusts and affairs. But anyway, all the way through, one of the markers between a barbarian and a Greek is how the women are treated. It's a dividing line. So I don't think it's possible to have the chivalric, the gentleman, the lady, without this understanding of the feminine. And I think that is peculiar to the West.
Yeah, that reminds me of the story of the rape of the Sabine women when they steal all the women away, and the men are immediately brought up to arms.
Yes.
And saying like this great violation against femininity,
Mhm.
especially our women, like,
Yes, yes.
and what we understand to be feminine, like that this is violated, and we need to come up to arms and defend that.
But by that point, the Sabine women say, "Don't kill our new husbands."
Right. So
Let's be at peace and
Yes.
end this, which is quite extraordinary.
I would not like to be the man on the other side. His wife said, "No, I like my new husband. He kidnapped me, threw me over his shoulder, but I'm like, I came to save you." Yeah.
But what if she already has children by that other husband?
Ooh.
You see, this gets really complicated.
Yeah, it does.
That would be worse.
Yeah, we just showed the freshmen last weekend Iphigenia, the story of Agamemnon sacrificing his beloved daughter so the winds will blow,
Oh, Iphigenia.
so that the winds will
Yeah.
take them to Troy. And Clytemnestra confronts her husband when she realizes that he's going to do this to their beloved daughter and says, I have learned to submit to you. It's been hard. You killed my husband, and then she went on all the grievances that she had prior to their marriage. She said, but I have learned to obey you. right?
Mm.
And you have 4 children. She's the spokesman for the woman who's in the ancient world who doesn't have the power that the man does. And there's certain strong benefits that are incalculable to this notion of courtesia, with the fact that the savior of Christianity, the whole Judeo-Christian tradition, is born because a woman agrees to say yes to God.
Mm.
So Mary
Mm.
changes the landscape entirely for women.
Wow, that's fantastic.
Yes, and the medievalists understood this, and I think it's anticipated by the Greek and Roman, but they don't quite get it.
Mm.
But they protect marriage in a way that it isn't protected among the barbarians.
Mm.
At least that's a start.
Or even now today.
Well, we're going back to the barbaric ages. There's no doubt about it. I mean, there's some residual forms left, but the ones that really support a beautiful living have been undermined because those forms were in service of metaphysical insights.
Mm.
And that's what I hope to argue in this book, is that the forms, though they're not the decorum and the forms that accompany them, though they're not the same as charity, or virtue, they lay a foundation for the development of virtue, for the choice for charity over self-interest. They lay a foundation for it because they already restrain the soul, right? They teach that the appetites are not
Mm.
what come first, but being aware of those around you comes first. So
It reminds me, well, it seems like decorum is like a recognition of someone else's dignity.
mhm.
And so if you're able to see that, then it makes sense that it's the pathway towards becoming more virtuous.
So I don't like the word dignity.
You
So
don't?
let me just
Okay.
say-
All right.
You're wrong.
I don't know if you did read that paper, there's a real, no, he's not necessarily wrong. It's just, I don't want, I'm very influenced by this sociologist, Peter Berger, who makes a strong distinction between honor and dignity. I think it works actually, because we use the word dignity now as part of this equalizing tendency where everybody has his or her dignity. And that dignity can include everything from how I want to act, whether it's moral or immoral, to I should act only in a good way. It can be, it's so open-ended. But the world of honor requires that you recognize in the other where they stand in relation to the social order. So honor requires that I honor those who are in authority, which is different than the dignity.
Right.
Honor requires for a lady that I understand what a lady represents. Honor for a priest requires that I understand he's just not another guy on the street, you know. So we give honor to these roles that we play, which distinguish us from each other's ordinary being, just being in the world. So anyway, so that's my problem with dignity.
Interesting.
I'm not going to give you the same attention, as wonderful as you are, Tom, that I have to give my husband.
Of course.
Right. You know, so you have your dignity, but I have to honor him.
Yeah.
Interesting. So
Mm.
does dignity come as a consequence of honor in some cases? If someone shows through their actions or their position a certain level of excellence, does dignity come from that? Or is dignity just a completely separate thing
Yeah,
altogether?
I think it would be useful for me to read how Berger talks about it. You know, we talk about dignity seems to be the common denominator for just being human, because God made us in his image and likeness. Okay.
Okay.
So that's great. He made us in his image and likeness, but that doesn't tell us much about what makes each of us more worthy of praise than others, right? So that is a kind of a keen dividing line. I'm going to find this actually. It's on page 14. I don't remember exact, the way he words it is better than I'm saying it. All right, he says, this is a great line. Honor occupies about the same place in contemporary usage as chastity. At
Mhm.
best, honor and chastity are seen as ideological leftovers in the consciousness of obsolete classes,
Mm.
such as military officers or ethnic grandmothers, which is probably how my grandchildren see me. Oh, that's my Italian grandmother. She always says this. An honor-based society, this is not a quote, is one in which a person recognizes when he is insulted. Our society reflects American law, where insult is not, quote, actionable and is not recognized as a real injury. The insulted party must be able to prove material damage. On the contrary, in a hierarchical society, one that is aristocratic, the etiquette of everyday life consists of ongoing transactions of honor. To each his due. Okay. Dignity, on the other hand, always relates to this intrinsic humanity, but divested of all socially imposed roles or norms. It pertains to the self as such, to the individual, regardless of his position in society.
Mm.
So honor is that, let me put it this way. You don't know who you are in a classless society. You're not grounded.
Mhm.
See, this is the problem with equality. It
Mhm.
quickly, over 100 or 200 years, is going to lead to a depraved society. If we don't preserve those residual distinctions among us through the forms, through decorum, we're all going to be human, but we're not going to be able to see excellence.
Ah.
And excellence distinguishes us from each other, our different excellences, right?
Mhm.
Class provided that in the old aristocratic order, but in a healthy democratic order, education should still provide distinctions, right? Age should still provide distinctions.
Mhm.
Sex should still provide distinctions, right? A shame is
Mhm.
very helpful in making these distinctions, right? It's shameful, right, for a young woman to stay overnight with her boyfriend in a parent's home. Well, it happens all the time now.
It
There's
does.
no distinction. There's no protection of her because she claims that she has the same latitude that he does and so forth. So the parents are dishonored, the woman is dishonored, the son is disrespectful of the woman, the son is disrespectful of the parents. I could go on and on about that, but it happens all the time. We don't see these distinctions anymore as making it possible to only act one way instead of another way that we might choose.
Wow,
So
that's great.
that's an interesting insight, and it comes not from a Catholic, but from a sociologist.
Oh, that was a really good distinction.
Mm.
Um, I was actually hoping to talk about that part. I did read it. I just
Oh, did
think
you?
I missed
That's all right.
Yeah.
Okay, Tom.
No. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean,
So do you have questions about the role of decorum, which is, of course, convention
Uh-huh.
to some extent, and political life? Oh, how the two relate?
Yeah, I mean, I would just ask, like, how can one better understand decorum in their own life and practice it in a with a more ancient kind of view
Mm.
of decorum, not necessarily the way that we see it nowadays, because I feel like it's a
Uh-huh.
little bit watered down.
Well, it is. I had to give bullet points on one of these talks I gave on this topic, Isaac, and I'm terrible about how to or application.
Uh,
I,
Sure.
I mean, I enjoyed reading Jordan Peterson because he's got rules, and
Rules for life.
yeah,
Yeah.
that's right. And I love reading George Washington's 110 Rules of Civility. I was just talking about it the other day on President Washington's birthday. But I think one thing to do, I know this just sounds so, um, well, this is exactly what you would expect me to say. I think education,
Mm.
by exposing you to works like Herodotus or the Odyssey, where Penelope is delaying for 20 years having to marry the suitors.
Mm.
So many examples in the Odyssey. When you read those old works, you begin to see how civilization was built, what the boundaries were, because decorum is about boundaries.
Mm.
They're boundaries. And those boundaries tell you where you are, right? So I use the example often of in reading books, and if the professor would do this, it would be helpful to point these things out to young people. And I always feel like a school marm doing this when I teach these works. But all right, look at Telemachus at the beginning of the Odyssey. What is he's doing? He's depressed. He's sitting there in the middle of 121 suitors in his father's courtyard after his mother. And there's a stranger in the doorway.
Mm.
And when he looks up and he realizes he hasn't noticed that a stranger is there. And he's mortified because he hasn't greeted the stranger.
Mm.
So the whole scene that unfolds then is the welcome, the bringing in of the stranger, the seating of him down with the wash tables, and the bringing over from the servant women the warm bread and the meats and so forth, and waiting long after he's greeted him and made him comfortable and fed him to ask him his name.
Mm.
And I use that example to say that that's a long delay, and it doesn't proceed from suspicion. It proceeds from trust
Mhm.
and hospitality. So I think the beginning of decorum is hospitality. It's right there in the Odyssey. Right?
Mhm.
And other examples like that. I also tell people when I have to talk about this publicly, which I guess is right now, that getting off the internet, and I know this is on the internet, but getting off the internet
Mhm.
and talking to your neighbors, that sounds so elemental, but talking to your neighbors, talking to people
Yep.
rather than being uh, objectifying them is a beginning to decorum.
Mhm.
Um, there are other things I could talk about. I don't know that a school of manners is really effective, or what I'm talking about is something central to a beautiful life
Mhm.
and one that pushes back against vulgarity.
Mm.
And language, elevating language is a great part of that.
Mm.
It seems to me decorum filters thoughts, language, words that you might think that you wouldn't say. It filters those things to elevate a situation so that there can be a kind of communion with another.
It reminded me of what you're talking about there. You mentioned in there that there's like this push to have raw authenticity.
Oh, yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I'll talk about that a minute. Yes, indeed. So if I ever write this book, and thank you for giving me a chance to think about it again.
Absolutely, yeah.
It's hard to get things done. The political philosopher Rousseau uh, postulates this whole confessions on the fact that he's sincere.
Mm.
And he writes a discourse about how the arts and sciences and convention and so forth have gotten it all wrong, that what we have to be is open and sincere, find our authentic self, as it's said today. And actually, this has been a real turnaround in the whole understanding of how we should behave in the West. Um, what it has done is made us, as my Southern husband would say, naked instead of naked. He likes to say naked. You're naked. Because, yeah, you want to hide your flaws. You don't want to show your warts.
Yeah.
And decorum allows that as I was saying earlier, that screen or that veil that um, opens the door to a possibility of real authenticity, right?
Mm.
Which isn't exposing what you really think about the other, but giving the other a chance to reveal himself or herself in a way that doesn't damage their their potential for goodness, right?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, you have to keep hoping in each other. You see what decorum is hopeful
Mm.
because it hopes for the best in the other. It hopes for the right response. It hopes for the recognition. And I'm gonna get in trouble if I don't get home to my husband.
Yeah, gotta maintain that decorum.
That's all right. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Doctor.
Well, this was great fun, and maybe when I get further back into the book, we can talk about some examples. I'd love to give
That would
examples.
be wonderful. Wonderful. Love that.
Thank you both and good luck in this
Yeah.
project.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you so much,
All
Doctor.
right, bye.